Well, good afternoon, church. It's Father Strohm, priest associate for Pastoral Care, but today doing some teaching on the history of the Episcopal Church. This is part of our adult formation program at Redeemer, and what I'm going to do this afternoon, recording this on the 16th of October, is do slightly editing of my presentation this past Sunday, October 12th, between the two services. And I welcome you to this presentation, but I also, because it's about history, I hope you become a budding historian. Because if you don't study history, who are you? This is session 2 of a 3-part series entitled The History of the Episcopal Church. Probably should have named it A History of the Episcopal Church. In 90 minutes, I don't think it's going to be the history, and since through just 3 sessions of a total of 90 minutes of the total series, choices have to be made as to what to cover and what not to cover. Last week we heard a driving presentation by Father Mason on the colonial era to the early 1800s. Today the presentation is entitled From the Civil War to the Early 1900s. Turn the page. My interest, it's a 2-part presentation. First on the Civil War and its aftermath, and secondly, which is a domestic event, and then secondly, the Oxford movement, which came from England, which was imported into our country. But the first one is about Civil War, and my interest in Civil War began when I was a junior in high school. I think it was the first time we had to actually write a paper. So we had to take notes. And at that point in time, you took notes on 3x5 cards and 4x6 cards. And so it's the first time I've done this, so it was a lot of work, but it stimulated my interest in the Civil War forever. And of course, the Civil War, it has so many books that have been published by it, and it's a just continuing interest. Most of us would agree that the coming of the American Civil War, the war itself, and Reconstruction that followed are the central shapers of what this country was to become in the 19th century. The core issue, which we all know, was the existence of slavery, and not just the existence of slavery at the time of the war, but its future. Would it accompany the westward settlement of different areas and therefore states, and would they be permitted to have slavery? Slavery was defended by the southern states, among other arguments. One was states' rights. The federal government has no right to interfere with the states and how they do their business. And it was attacked by a number of things, including the abolitionist movement. And they saw slavery as a moral wrong. So what about the Episcopal Church and slavery? Leading up to the Civil War, the Episcopal Church officially avoided taking a position on slavery by framing it or naming it as a political rather than a moral issue. In contrast to other major denominations like the Methodists, the Presbyterians, Baptists, all of which fractured over the issue, the Episcopal Church maintained unity by sidestepping the conflict. And that was a position that ultimately favored its pro-slavery Southern members, because the South controlled the United States Senate, and it alienated many black and anti-slavery Episcopalians. The Episcopal Church, as an institution, chose neutrality in order to maintain unity. Neutrality in order to maintain unity. It viewed slavery as a political issue, not a moral issue, and therefore, as the church, it should not be involved in political matters, including slavery. Some Southern bishops used religious arguments to support slavery, arguing that because Scripture did not explicitly condemn it, therefore it was not a sin. And if not a sin, there were no grounds for forbidding it. Bishop William Meade of Virginia owned slaves. Presiding Bishop John Henry Hopkins taught that the Bible permitted slavery. And if it's going to be done away with all at all, he argued, it should be by agreement, not by war. Moreover, in the Old Testament, slavery was a widely accepted practice among the Hebrew people. And would God have permitted an inherently sinful institution to exist? And in the New Testament, in the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, we hear Paul say, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." Many Southern Episcopalians were slaveholding families. And as a slaveholding class, that is the rich, they were the financial foundation of the church in the South. Southern bishops argued that slavery was actually beneficial to slaves by bringing them Christianity and civilizing them. So churches benefited financially from slavery, and they used slave labor, and clergy often owned slaves themselves. Now, you may have heard recently in the news the issue about reparation for slavery. I'm thinking of Georgetown University, for example, in Washington, D.C., which has a whole project about that because the university was built with slave labor. The same at Virginia Theological Seminary, the major seminary of the Episcopal Church. And I think there's some question now whether Washington National Cathedral had slave labor at some point or not. So the issue of reparation is ripe. In 1861, when the southern states seceded, the dioceses within the Confederacy gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America. So what would happen next when this happened? One scholar of church history has written, quote, "It is an acceptable principle of the Anglican Communion that the churches in separate countries should be independent." So the idea was the southern states had formed the Confederacy, which they considered an independent country, and therefore was independent of the Episcopal Church before the war. By doing this, we can say that there was not a formal schism, a formal breaking of the Episcopal Church. The Confederate States of America, the church there, had their own Book of Common Prayer. They had their own adapted worship that they used. And I don't have a Book of Common Prayer from the South, but I do have little prayer books that both the Union soldiers had and the Confederate soldiers had, and they were different. As a complement to avoiding schism, that is, separate countries, not separate churches, nothing was done in the North to prevent the reunification of the two churches. At the General Convention of 1862, the Episcopal Church was clearly understood by the majority there, and it was just as clearly their wish to avoid any action that would suggest the existence of schism or do anything else that might tend to perpetuate the bitterness between the two sections once the war was over. In other words, there was avoidance of friction. The division was viewed basically as an administration separation now that the Confederacy had been formed. And the General Convention essentially said, let's remain neutral on this separation question in the hope that it will bring unity again after the war. And indeed, that is what happened. At the 1865 General Convention in Philadelphia, the Southern Diocese rejoined the Episcopal Church. At that convention, there were many resolutions offered in the House of Deputies to condemn the Southern Diocese. None of them passed. Instead, the deputies passed a simple resolution of thanksgiving for the restoration of peace in the country and unity in the church. The only Southern bishop consecrated in the Confederate Church during the separation, Richard Hooker Wilmer, was accepted into the reunited church, notwithstanding that he was under house arrest in Alabama for instructing his clergy not to pray for the President of the United States as part of his opposition to military rule, which happened after the war. The Northern military moved in to maintain order. Now, what about Reconstruction? What happened after the war? The church again prioritized institutional unity over addressing what was clearly systematic racism that was faced by the newly emancipated slaves. They may be free, but there's certainly going to be systematic racism shown to them. They're not going to be full citizens. We reunited, but did not seek justice, even among our own Black Episcopalians. Southern dioceses, therefore, were enabled to continue to practice discrimination, and we've all heard about Jim Crow, and we've all heard about divisions between black and white, and not only in restaurants and water fountains, but also in churches. Continuing with Reconstruction, there was a freedman, what was called a Freedmen's Commission, which was established in 1865 by General Convention, and it was a commission to help with the education and evangelization of former slaves, but it wasn't provided with enough resources. The commission was largely ineffective. It received insufficient money and was viewed with resentment by the southern dioceses, which considered it an intrusion in their internal affairs. So here's kind of a diocesan rights argument to parallel states' rights argument. The commission was ultimately dissolved in 1878. Even by 1877, it had made little headway, with a report noting only a small number of black congregations and clergy in the South benefited from it. With their new freedom, many black Episcopalians, tired of segregation and racist treatment, left the denomination in the late 1860s to join historically black churches such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the mother church for that denomination is in Charleston, and you've all heard of it because of the killings there. Southern dioceses actively resisted racial equality. Many refused to grant equal status to black members or ordain any black clergy. As Reconstruction ended, Southern bishops attempted to formalize segregation through church law and did so in some circumstances. So that's a broad stroke Episcopal Church in the Civil War. If slavery and racial discrimination issues confronted the church in the 19th century, there was also theological and liturgical disputes as well. In particular, in the middle of the 19th century, there was high church Anglo-Catholics, which Redeemer is, versus the low church evangelical disputes. Now here's a little background on this, and this is about the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was a theological movement of high church members of the Church of England, which began in the 1830s and eventually developed into what we call today Anglo-Catholicism. The movement, whose original followers were mostly associated with the University of Oxford, argued for the reinstatement of older Christian traditions of faith and their inclusion into the Anglican liturgy and theology. Just a little background on that. When the Reformation occurred in England, and the reformers took over the church, in essence, they would take down all the statutes. They would take any colored glass out of the church. They would destroy the stone altars and put in little tables instead. So it was a dramatic change from the traditions of the church that had come from the Middle Ages. Now, those who wanted to go back and include this again were called Tractarians. And that was because they issued a number of tracts or little publications written beginning in 1861, which promoted this movement. And they developed what they called a branch theory. They argued that Anglicanism, being one of three branches of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and you've all heard that phrase from the Creed. The other two branches were the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Anglicanism, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic. Notice who's missing. Protestants. These Tractarians argued for the inclusion of traditional aspects of the liturgy that were practiced in medieval times because they believed the church had become too plain, P-L-A-I-N. The first church I served out of seminary was at Incarnation in Penfield, New York, eastern first-tier suburb of Rochester. And it was built in the 1950s and was common then. There was an evangelical revival, and they were made, many churches, including Incarnation, was an A-frame building with very light wood and either foggy or clear glass. No beautiful church windows. Anglo-Catholicism put an emphasis on Catholic theology, liturgy, and what we call the ceremonial. That is, whatever we do during our worship besides saying the words. Many key participants subsequently converted to Roman Catholicism, the most famous being John Henry Newman. He converted from Anglicanism, the Church of England, to the Church of Rome. And look who's on the current issue of the Living Church. John Henry Newman, who just in a few days, not in a few days, but just a couple of years ago, was named the 38th Doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. And I wanted to read to you a brief comment on this. This is written by Benjamin King, who's at the Seminary of the Southwest, but I think he was originally at Sewanee. And here's how he views Newman as an example of what he calls a bridge. In October 2019, on the day before John Henry Newman was canonized by Pope Francis, I addressed cardinals, politicians, and diplomats gathered inside the Vatican. I asked them to consider Newman as a bridge between Anglicanism and Catholicism. My knees were knocking under the table, but I don't think they knew. What I didn't know was what I would face a much harder task at Westminster Abbey back in London. A week later, when among British Anglicans and Catholics, I asked them to consider Newman as a bridge. My premise was that Newman was a sort of theological bridge linking the two communions, transferring to Anglicanism the Catholic vision of the church that he read in the early church fathers and what he saw on his Mediterranean travels, by also bringing his Anglican scholarship of the fathers of the early church with him when he became a Catholic. Although he crossed the bridge to the Catholic side, most Anglicans who learned from Newman about the Catholic roots of the church remained on the Anglican side of the bridge. Arriving from England, the Oxford movement led to the adoption of more elaborate rituals, many of which we have here at Redeemer. Its impact in the Episcopal Church generally resulted in accusations by those who opposed it as ritualism, with more Protestant-leaning Episcopalians. What they mean by that is because the liturgy is so rich and we have so much ceremonial going on in addition to hearing the words, is that some people begin, or the danger I should say, is that people will begin worshiping the worship and not God. So the tensions over evangelicalism versus Anglo-Catholicism eventually led to schism in 1873. A group of evangelicals split to form the Reformed Episcopal Church, which rejected ritualism and other Catholic tendencies. I'm not aware whether there's a Reformed Episcopal Church in our area, but when I was in Buffalo, there is one, and they actually ran ads to promote themselves. So what takeaways can we have from this presentation and the history of it? Well, one would be that the Episcopal Church, compared to other denominations during the Civil War, had a sort of short-lived and more gentle fracture, not a schism, than the other Protestant churches. And this reflects kind of a historical principle of Anglicanism. That is, the willingness of in this case, the Episcopal Church, to carry tensions together and walk together amidst disagreement. And when we do that, we're at our best. And so you could argue during the Civil War that we were at our best. We did not split, but despite the issue of slavery, we did not split as a church. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and see you the next time.